All right. Good morning, everybody. Good evening for those who joined from the United States, and there's even some people, some very courageous people joining from Europe. So I give a special welcome for those people who'd like to get up at 3:30 in the morning. Even I don't get up that early. My name is Bert Hoffman. I am the director of the East Asian Institute, and we are delighted to have Dr. Ayhan Kose of the World Bank today for our first Zoom distinguished public lecture. I'll introduce Dr. Kose in a moment more formally. The topic of the lecture is the world economy in times of COVID. And of course, for anybody, COVID is on people's minds, but especially for economists. And most economists have also turned epidemiologists in the meantime, because how COVID-19, the disease, will evolve will also determine a lot on how the world economy will be doing. There's lots of questions outstanding, not just about the disease, but also about how the economy will be doing. The projections, frankly, are awful. The World Bank has put out a projection of a -5% global GDP projection. I'm sure Dr. Kose will talk more about it. IMF is in the same ballpark. But there are downsides and risks, and the risks are largely on the negative side. So a very difficult moment for the world economy, a very difficult moment for many policymakers around the world, and we're very glad to see that a number of policymakers are joining this public lecture. We will, Dr. Kose will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then there is Q&A. Please use the Q&A button to submit questions. Unfortunately, we can't let you live into the room, but I will read out the questions as you submit them. Dr. Kose is my former colleague of the World Bank. He is the director of the prospects department in the economic prospects department in the World Bank, and it is, if you want, a thinking hard on the world economy and on the regional economies. And they bring regular publications, including the Global Economic Prospects, which I'm sure you know about. Dr. Kose used to work with the IMF. He also used to work at the University of Chicago, Booth School, and at INSEAD and at Brandeis International Business School. He is also a non-resident fellow of the Brookings Institutions and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. I'm delighted to have him here for the first Zoom public lecture of the East Asian Institute. And over to you, Ayhan.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Warm greetings from Washington, D.C. Let me first thank Bert. I used to visit Bert in Beijing. We had this wonderful event, and I was hoping to actually visit East Asia again and stop by in Singapore, which I was able to spend considerable amount of time when I visited INSEAD multiple times. But unfortunately, we needed to postpone all of these trips. I'm hoping that these days will pass and we will get together. It's a great honor to give the first lecture of the Institute in this format. Let me share my slides quickly, and then we will take it from there. Bert asked me to talk about the state of world economy in times of COVID-19. I thought that I would structure the lecture around 4 questions. The first one, what are global growth prospects in the near term? There we have a very deep, highly synchronized global recession. In fact, it's an historical episode. In the context of emerging market developing economies, it will be an exceptional one in the sense that these economies will contract the first time on record, at least in the modern era. The second question, what are the main risks to this somber outlook? We still think that risks are tilted to the downside, and the main risk is a more protracted pandemic. The third question, what are the likely long-term implications of COVID-19? Given the type of basically collapse we are seeing around, it's difficult to be optimistic. These types of deep recessions often followed by weaker potential output, weaker investment, and weaker productivity over the long term. And finally, what are policy priorities? I think their policymakers need to act fast, they need to be bold, they need to be comprehensive in terms of addressing the health crisis and economic crisis currently underway. Beyond that, of course, they need to look forward. Global cooperation is essential in this context. Throughout the presentation, I will use this acronym, EMDEs, and that stands for Emerging Market Developing Economies. Let me start with the first question.
Ayhan,
yes.
we can't see the slides yet. You need to share your screen.
Just a second. Okay. Okay, can you see it now?
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good evening for those who joined from the United States, and there's even some people, some very courageous people joining from Europe. So I give a special welcome for those people who'd like to get up at 3:30 in the morning. Even I don't get up that early. My name is Bert Hoffman. I am the director of the East Asian Institute, and we are delighted to have Dr. Ayhan Kose of the World Bank today for our first Zoom distinguished public lecture. I'll introduce Dr. Kose in a moment more formally. The topic of the lecture is the world economy in times of COVID. And of course, for anybody, COVID is on people's minds, but especially for economists. And most economists have also turned epidemiologists in the meantime, because how COVID-19, the disease, will evolve will also determine a lot on how the world economy will be doing. There's lots of questions outstanding, not just about the disease, but also about how the economy will be doing. The projections, frankly, are awful. The World Bank has put out a projection of a -5% global GDP projection. I'm sure Dr. Kose will talk more about it. IMF is in the same ballpark. But there are downsides and risks, and the risks are largely on the negative side. So a very difficult moment for the world economy, a very difficult moment for many policymakers around the world, and we're very glad to see that a number of policymakers are joining this public lecture. We will, Dr. Kose will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then there is Q&A. Please use the Q&A button to submit questions. Unfortunately, we can't let you live into the room, but I will read out the questions as you submit them. Dr. Kose is my former colleague of the World Bank. He is the director of the prospects department in the economic prospects department in the World Bank, and it is, if you want, a thinking hard on the world economy and on the regional economies. And they bring regular publications, including the global economic prospects, which I'm sure you know about. Dr. Kose used to work with the IMF. He also used to work at the University of Chicago, Booth School, and at INSEAD, and at Brandeis International Business School. He is also a non-resident fellow of the Brookings Institutions and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy research. I'm delighted to have him here for the first Zoom public lecture of the East Asian Institute. And over to you, Ayhan.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Warm greetings from Washington, D.C. Let me first thank Bert. I used to visit Bert in Beijing. We had this wonderful event, and I was hoping to actually visit East Asia again and stop by in Singapore, which I was able to spend considerable amount of time when I visited INSEAD multiple times. But unfortunately, we needed to postpone all of these trips. I'm hoping that these days will pass and we will get together. It's a great honor to give the first lecture of the Institute in this format. Let me share my slides quickly, and then we will take it from there. Bert asked me to talk about the state of world economy in times of COVID-19. I thought that I would structure the lecture around 4 questions. The first one, what are global growth prospects in the near term? There we have a very deep, highly synchronized global recession. In fact, it's an historical episode. In the context of emerging market developing economies, it will be an exceptional one in the sense that these economies will contract the first time on record, at least in the modern era. The second question, what are the main risks to this somber outlook? We still think that risks are tilted to the downside, and the main risk is a more protracted pandemic. The third question, what are the likely long-term implications of COVID-19? Given the type of basically collapse we are seeing around, it's difficult to be optimistic. These types of deep recessions often followed by weaker potential output, weaker investment, and weaker productivity over the long term. And finally, what are policy priorities? I think their policymakers need to act fast, they need to be bold, they need to be comprehensive in terms of addressing the health crisis and economic crisis currently underway. Beyond that, of course, they need to look forward. Global cooperation is essential in this context. Throughout the presentation, I will use this acronym, EMDEs, and that stands for Emerging Market Developing Economies. Let me start with the first question. Can you see it now?
All good now, thank you.
Okay, so the first question is, what are global growth prospects in the near term? Here, I think students of economic history know that global economy experienced all types of crises, and including these types of health crises as well, a different scope, a different magnitude. But we have never seen the type of policy response we have seen over the past 8 months to contain the pandemic. There have been unprecedented measures in terms of school closures, in terms of event cancellations, work closures, and travel restrictions. In some cases, these containment measures affected pretty much all the countries in the world. These measures were necessary. They translated into an outright collapse in activity in multiple dimensions. You see this when you look at mobility indicators in terms of activity at work, in terms of transit, in terms of retail transactions, across the board, especially during the months of March, April, May. Depending on country you look at, we saw significant declines in mobility. The implications of these containment measures also manifest themselves when you look at high-frequency indicators of trade, tourism services, portfolio flows, and of course, oil prices. Here, I basically picked up 4 indicators you can think of quite important. In April 2020, we saw a historical collapse in new export orders. In March 2020, we saw collapse in tourist arrivals. In some countries, tourist arrivals went down to 0. Of course, again in March, we saw a sharp decline in net portfolio inflows to emerging market developing economies. And something remarkable happened in oil markets. Oil prices declined the largest amount since 1960 in March 2020. So against this background, we need to think about how the kind of the activity is going to evolve in coming years. Of course, there are different ways of characterizing what happened to the global economy. It's fair to say that it is a sudden stop of activity in basically majority of countries around the world. So our forecast suggests this year global economies contract by 5.2%. Of course, it is important to think what we were projecting at the beginning of the year. We were thinking global economy will expand 2.5%. So relative to what we were projecting, this is a truly historical decline in output we are expecting. In the case of advanced economies, contraction is going to be larger, about 7%. Emerging market developing economies will see the first contraction in output, at least since 1960. These economies deliver year in, year out growth, but this year they won't be able to do that. They will see a severe recession. Now, when you look at the regions, the story is not that different, except in East Asia Pacific, we are expecting still growth this year. That's primarily because of our expectation that China will deliver growth by about 1%. China will be the only major economy that's going to see expansion in output according to our projections. When you look at other regions, the story is really quite somber. Take, for example, Latin America and Caribbean. We are expecting the region to contract by about 7.2%. This is a region that depends on commodities. In some countries, tourism revenues are critical. In some countries, remittance inflows are critical. And in some countries, of course, integration with other countries, including the United States, Euro area, China, quite important in terms of trade flows and export revenues. Now, there are some other regions like Europe and Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. They will all see historical contractions for the types of reasons I mentioned, and I'm going to discuss these in detail soon. A region that has no commodity exporter, South Asia, will also contract and see the first contraction in decades, as India will see a contraction by about 3.2%. The region will contract around 2.7%. Now, we are expecting a rebound in output next year, but that rebound is not going to compensate the losses basically we are seeing this year. We are expecting growth next year to be around 4.2%, and emerging market developing economies to go back to their average growth, what we saw over the period 2012-2018, around 4.6%. Now, it is important to put this global recession in context. When we think about global recessions, we are thinking episodes that basically translate into contractions in global per capita output. Since 1870, global economy experienced 14 global recessions. This one will be the deepest since the Second World War. And it will be the fourth deepest episode since 1870. The other three episodes are important to remember. One was associated with the First World War. The second one was the Great Depression. The third one was the episode global economy experienced following the Second World War. So if you take out these two war episodes, we are seeing the deepest global recession after the Great Depression over the past 150 years. This episode is also notable because it will translate into most synchronized recession, in the sense that more than 90% of countries will experience declines in their per capita output. This is going to be even higher than what we saw at the deepest point of the Great Depression. Trade is also critical, and forward-looking indicators suggest a persistent weakness. The weakness started prior to the pandemic, as we saw a slowdown in trade starting 2017. This year, we are expecting trade growth to be around minus 13.4%. This will be basically the lowest growth we see in global trade, again, since the Second World War, and deeper than the downturn during the global financial crisis. Let me briefly talk about the East Asia Pacific region. As I mentioned, the region will see a slowdown in 2020, but it will rebound in a vigorous fashion in 2021. If you take out China from the sample and focus on East Asia Pacific, excluding China, the rest of the region will see a contraction this year. But we are expecting, as I said, a vigorous rebound next year. In fact, the region will see growth outside of China that is going to be, we think, equal to the average growth of past 30 years over the period 1990 to 2019, around 5%. Let me turn to the second question. What are the main risks to the outlook? Here, it's important to think about the short-term risks and the medium to long-term risks. In the short term, the main risk is the possibility of more protracted pandemic. We already see signs of outbreaks in different countries after they basically reduced the number of infections to a certain level. The global economy came to this recession with very high debt levels, and of course, because of the necessity to large spending, governments are going to add more to already large debt stock. And this type of highly leveraged economies are subject to the risk of financial stress that can easily turn into financial crisis. The escalation of trade tensions between major economies is another risk we cannot rule out. Policymakers employed large-scale measures on the fiscal side as well as on the monetary side. Down the road, we need to worry about effectiveness of these large-scale measures in stimulating activity. There is no question the monetary policy interventions supported financial markets and stabilized them quickly after the volatility we saw in March. Now, over the medium term, the big question is whether we can sustain a speedy recovery. So, in that context, risk of a slower recovery and weaker growth a serious possibility. The reason for this outcome could be different. It could be because we see lower for longer commodity prices. It could be because we see longer lasting changes in the behavior of households and firms, more risk aversion. Of course, there is a possibility of deglobalization associated with fragmentation and retreat from global value chains. Down the road, we cannot rule out the possibility of larger than expected adverse impact of the crisis on potential growth, which I'm going to discuss very soon. When these types of deep crises take place and income collapses be part of the kind of the output, there is the possibility of social unrest. And of course, we are worried about weaker development outcomes in an environment of weak growth and rising poverty. Let me briefly talk about the more protracted pandemic risk. When you look at advanced economies as a group, now these economies are on the other side of the curve in the sense that daily infection rates have been going down. But in recent weeks, we see that there has been an upturn, primarily because of the rapid increase in the number of infections in the United States. If you look at emerging market developing economies outside of China, the story is different and quite dramatic. Of course, China contained the pandemic, experienced the deep side of the pandemic earlier. But other emerging market developing economies, especially in some regions, are still feeling the full effects of the pandemic. If you look at Latin America, Caribbean, if you look at South Asia, if you look at Middle East, if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, you see the number of infections are increasing at a rapid pace. In these regions, there is limited availability of health services, limited availability of testing. So we need to better understand the gravity of the problem, of course, but it is very clear, even with these numbers, the pandemic is in full force and will have a serious mark on these economies in every sense of the word. Now, I talked about forecasts. Something dramatic happened over the past 6 months. And what we saw, especially during the months of March, April, and May, was a historical first. Global growth forecasts experienced their fastest and steepest downgrades. If you compare what happened with the changes in forecasts during the 1991 and 2009 global recessions, those recessions look ordinary events. Of course, consensus forecasts have been subject to significant downgrades over the past 3 months, but at the same time, in recent weeks, there have been some stabilization, and this could be a good sign. Having said that, there is still significant uncertainty around these forecasts. This uncertainty implies that we need to go beyond the point forecast and think about possible scenarios. In addition to our baseline scenario I described, we looked at 2 scenarios. One is a downside scenario and one is an upside scenario. In the downside scenario, there is a possibility of a more protracted pandemic and maybe a second wave. If that scenario materializes, global growth declines to -8% relative to -5.2 I mentioned in the baseline. Advanced economies will see a contraction of about 10%, and emerging market developing economies will end up seeing a 5% contraction. In the case of upside scenario, there is a speedy containment. And if that scenario materializes and the economies normalize quickly, we might see a better outcome, but that better outcome will be still 2 times worse than what we saw during the global financial crisis. Specifically, our basic upside scenario implies global growth would be around -4%. As I mentioned, there is very large uncertainty around these forecasts I mentioned, and this uncertainty will be with us for the foreseeable future as we need to monitor the evolution of the pandemic and how we are going to, in a sense, contain and normalize our lives and economic activity. Now, the big issue, of course, after thinking about the short-term impact, what will be the medium to long-term impact? This year, there will be very large losses in terms of global output. There will be growth next year, but this growth will not be enough to compensate these losses. In fact, when you look at what happened during previous global recessions, global economy did not go back to its pre-global recession trend. And after experiencing such a deep downturn, it is unlikely we will see the global economy to go back to the pre-COVID trend in the near future. In this context, let me turn to the third question. What are the likely long-term implications of COVID-19? Here, the big question boils down to what will happen to economies when they experience deep recessions, and in some cases, these deep recessions are associated with financial crisis. Of course, anytime you have this shock that is very large magnitude, you see a sharp increase in uncertainty and a collapse in confidence. This has an immediate impact on investment. Investment collapses, often 2 to 3 times larger than what we see in the case of output. When that happens, and there are losses associated with human capital, and there are, of course, losses associated with productivity, potential growth and potential output are adversely affected. In the case of a recession, for example, 4 years after the recession, there is about 6% decline in potential output relative to the baseline. If the crisis or the recession translates into a financial crisis, then the decline in potential output is around -8%. So we also looked at what happens to investment and productivity after major health crisis. Here we focus on the case of SARS, MERS, Ebola, and Zika. And what is striking is that even those epidemics, when you compare with COVID-19, a kind of much more moderate, translate into significant and persistent losses in terms of investment and in terms of labor productivity. In the case of investment, the decline over 5 years is around 12%. In the case of labor productivity, it is larger than 6%. Now, this is a kind of a special event because of its scope, because of its depth, and because of its very nature. We think that there are factors that could aggregate the long-term costs associated with the pandemic. The first one is the trend slowdown in potential growth we basically witnessed even prior to the pandemic. What happened after the global financial crisis, we saw, of course, a decline in growth in advanced economies as well as emerging market developing economies over 2010s, but we also saw a decline in potential growth of these economies. What happened during the pandemic, in addition to very large losses associated with, the changes in investment behavior, as well as, very large employment losses that could generate erosion of human capital, there were significant challenges in terms of delivering education to school-age kids. And that has long-term implications when we think about how kids acquire human capital and the impediments created by the pandemic in terms of the process of acquiring human capital. Now, when we think about the long-term implications of the forecast, we also need to remember where we were prior to the crisis and how we were looking at the future about the global economy's potential to generate growth. What happened over the past decade is that we saw an increasing pessimism about future growth prospects. So if you look at 10-year ahead growth forecasts at the global level, prior to the pandemic, we experienced a prolonged period of downgrades. For example, in 2010, 10-year ahead growth forecast was around 3.3%. That number went down to 2.9% in 2014, 2.5% in 2018, and now it is hovering around 2.4%. So at the global level, there is this ingrained pessimism when it comes to global growth in the long term. Now, this is also the case when you look at advanced economies' growth prospects, but their structural challenges are much larger, associated with demographic changes, associated with investment slowdown, and associated with, of course, the trend slowdown in productivity growth. And there has been a gradual decline in long-term growth forecasts of advanced economies, to the extent that in early 2000s, we thought that these economies could generate growth 2.9% over the next decade. But now that number went down to 1.6%. Of course, the engine of global growth over the past 4 decades has been emerging market developing economies. Even in these economies, there has been a serious deterioration in long-term growth forecasts since the 2009 global recession. We thought in 2010, these economies could generate growth around 6.1% over the next decade. But now we are thinking maybe that number is below 4%. So the big question for us as we look to the future, whether the pandemic will have basically a magnified impact and impede global growth to the extent that we will end up with even weaker growth in the medium term. This brings me to the final question. What are policy priorities? I think when we think about emerging market developing economies, there have been serious disruptions, primarily because of their integration into the global economy. These economies are basically significant drivers of global supply chains. In many of these economies, tourism revenues are critical in terms of how they contribute to GDP. Remittance inflows, of course, account for, in some regions, a sizable share of GDP, including East Asia Pacific, and commodity exports play an important role in their total exports. And when you think about how pandemic affected the commodities, the remittances, the tourism sector, and the global supply chains, you worry about the implications and the necessity for policy response. Moreover, in many emerging market developing economies, there is rampant informality. And that informality has consequences in terms of how basically you adjust to the pandemic and how you employ policies and how these policies can be effective in terms of reaching those in this informal sector. High informality also comes with weaker social safety nets and limited access to medical resources. So, against this serious set of challenges, policymakers around the world responded aggressively to the COVID-19 crisis. You saw very large increases in government spending that will translate into historical deficits and much higher debt levels in emerging market developing economies. And of course, these low-income developing countries, they have to deal with, sizable informal sectors. Now, we also saw on the monetary policy side, sharp reductions in interest rates and new experiments through asset purchases by central banks in emerging market developing economies to stabilize financial markets. Of course, when you think about the role of the public sector, this is the time the public sector has to come and play that role. When you think about the role of the central banks, this is the time they need to play this role aggressively. The question remains, though, how these economies will normalize their policies and exit this ultra-accommodation stance. Let me quickly summarize the policy priorities we see that are critical. The first priority is to deal with the problem at hand and address the health and economic crisis. That means supporting healthcare systems and providing the necessary help to vulnerable groups and viable corporates. The objective is not just to stimulate these economies. The objective is to make sure that activity stays at a certain level and you do not leave anybody behind in terms of households as well as viable corporate entities. This storm will pass. The policymakers need to make sure their economies come out of it in a way that they can function. Now, coordinating policies globally to ensure the kind of smooth flow of critical goods and provide the necessary debt relief to the poor developing economies critical. Beyond the crisis, once the crisis abates, policymakers really need to be forward-looking by putting in place policies for sustained long-term growth. And there, they need very strong policy frameworks so they can credibly exit this period of accommodation. I mentioned very large debt levels. Enhancing debt transparency, enhancing investment transparency, going to be very important in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, in terms of managing debt, in terms of basically having credible fiscal positions. Now, undertaking reforms and creating the necessary business environment to basically support activity, going to be also critical. Now, I talked about many downside risks associated with this crisis. Of course, with the crisis, there are some upside risks. Like every other crisis, this crisis presents opportunities. How we use digital technology, how we approach education, how we do business will be changed quite dramatically. These changes could turn into dividends if there are complementary policies. In this context, strengthening institutions and governance practices going to be more critical than ever. And of course, we believe global community need to coordinate policies to address global challenges. Pandemic is a big lesson when it comes to threats to global public health. We need to be forthcoming. We need to be transparent. We need to have systems to basically coordinate action and the response. When it comes to global trade and the financial system, we need to find solutions to problems in a multilateral framework. And of course, we need to understand that we cannot postpone the problems of today to tomorrow. This is also critically true when it comes to climate change. I think if we discussed these issues a year ago, and if I told you that there is a serious possibility of pandemic hitting the global economy, I wouldn't be a credible speaker. But it's also true, there are serious challenges associated with climate change and how climate change could translate into risks materializing. Right now, we are thinking those risks as low probability events. So it is important for the global community to address these challenges and address these challenges with coordinated action. Let me quickly summarize. I posed 4 questions today. The first one, what are global growth prospects in the near term? Global economy is going through the deepest and most synchronized global recession since Second World War. And this is the first recession for emerging market developed economies on record as a group. Second question, what are the main risks to the outlook? That question starts with the answer. Risks are tilted to the downside, and we should not, rule out the possibility of a more protracted pandemic, especially in the coming months, the winter months. Third question, what are the likely long-term implications of COVID-19? There are serious downside risks in terms of weaker potential output, weaker investment, and weaker productivity over the long term. And finally, what are policy priorities? I think the important issue now is to address the health crisis, pursue reforms to reignite growth, and coordinate policies globally. Let me end with one observation. There is a discussion about the shape of the recovery, and I saw the same discussion during the 2009 episode, and many proposed during these recessions. Whether it will be a V shape, it will be a W shape, it will be a U shape. I saw L shape proposed, you go down and you stay there. A saxophone shape recovery, I still couldn't figure it out. A bed type shape recovery. And then there is this inverse square root shape recovery. Nowadays, I see Z-shaped recovery and this swoosh shape recovery. I think this discussion could simplify the matters, but we should all remember this is a health crisis and a human tragedy with serious consequences. whatever the shape of the recovery, it will be a painful one. It will be painful for individuals, and it will be painful for future generations. It's our hope is that policymakers will be bold, will be aggressive, will be comprehensive in their interventions, and they will take the lessons from this episode. With that, let me stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ayhan. This was very, very interesting, and it raises a lot of interesting questions. I have many questions on my list, so we'll get right to that. And the first question is from Subramania Srinivas, who asks, so you're pretty pessimistic. The markets around the world seem to be very optimistic because they're almost back to where they were before COVID. Haven't they read your report?
So, thank you. So I think that it's obvious markets are pricing a much faster recovery. And there are different reasons to explain the market behavior, especially in the context of equity markets and especially in the United States. The first one is the kind of the liquidity provided by central banks. So here we are in the middle of a very deep economic crisis, but there is no credit crunch except, for some low-income economies having difficulties. So, in fact, there is ample liquidity that I think supports financial markets handsomely. There is also this compositional effect. When we think about financial markets, we should keep in mind when you look at equities that are performing extremely well, these are equities basically tied to high-tech industries and digital technologies. And finally, I think we should also remember bear equity markets 5 months ago. I think that we started working on this issue seriously around mid-January and late January. At that point, we really focused on what was going on in China. But I think equity markets were breaking records during that period as well. So in terms of ability of equity markets predicting the future, we don't need to go back far. I think what happened in January and February is that equity markets are not that good thinking through the kind of the direction of activity.
Okay. I'm not sure whether I'm ready to set my bets yet on the equity market. I'm going to combine two questions, one from Professor Chong-An Bai of Peking University and one from Tsinghua University, and one from Dr. Sarah Tong from the East Asian Institute. And the question is, I mean, there's clearly been an aggravation in light of COVID, an aggravation of the trade tensions and the trade war between the US and China. To what extent have you taken that into account in your projections? And two, what can be done to counter this anti-globalization sentiment that has been emerging in the aftermath of COVID-19? Not just US, China, but more general, a lot of deglobalization talk, a lot of redesigning global value change. Is that the right answer, or how should we think about that?
So, in the context of trade, let me quickly answer the first question. Our baseline projections assume that this phase one mini trade deal will be intact. We think that the deal will be there and implemented to the best of ability of these economies. So in our baseline, we are not accounting for escalation of trade tensions. But as I mentioned, there is this risk that these trade tensions could escalate. If that happens, I think we will see a much worse outcome. Right now, I think we are in the kind of the deep trunks of the crisis, and we saw global supply chains already disrupted, trade interrupted for a variety of reasons. But I think this will be like putting fuel on the fire if countries escalate trade tensions in an unnecessary fashion. About the second question, really critical when we think about the future of the global economy. When you look at what happened over the past 3 decades, how trade has been instrumental in terms of promoting growth and reducing poverty, the story and the kind of the prospects now are quite different. And we need to think about the impact of the pandemic, for example, on poverty. This year, for the first time after a long time, we will see much higher numbers, new poor added to the ranks of existing poor, anywhere between 70 to 100 million. And if we go back and in a sense lose the gains associated with the maturation of global supply chains, associated with the efficiencies countries gain and jobs created, that will be serious consequences in terms of not just short-term growth prospects, but the long-term growth prospects. Most of the time, of course, there is this tendency to think, what is the impact of trade on growth in, year to year? We should all remember that trade has very large benefits because of productivity spillovers, and we will lose those. So what should countries do? Obviously, there is a number of countries out there. They are having serious difficulties with populist movements, and there is a clear desire to rewrite the kind of the rules of global trading system, and we saw with the kind of the WTO experience. It is important to remember the idea that we will go back to 70s, we will go back to 60s, and rewind the gains we had will translate into dramatic losses. I think the cool heads one way or another should prevail, and as policymakers, we need to make sure there are greater gains shared by a greater segments of societies going forward. I'm not saying this is easy to do. We economists don't have ready-made prescriptions for that. But we should also think about the complaints of these societies. We tend to think that, there are serious challenges because of technology, not necessarily trade, but of course, manifestation of that is often through trade. So we need to think through how we can, design these policies much more rigorously to address the, in a sense, grievances of those who basically lose their jobs, one way or another, trade-related policy interventions.
Thanks very much. Yeah, look, maybe the one small upside of the pandemic is that populist government don't seem to be doing very well in managing the pandemic, in part because they want to be popular, but that's not working. And so there might be a backlash against populism, which could in turn improve the environment for trade and globalization. Professor Denis Croix of the Lee Kuan Yew School, our neighbor, and he's also my boss in a way, has a very intriguing and interesting question. He said, look, there is really a threat of a financial crisis or a fiscal financial crisis following this economic crisis that we're in and following the health crisis. Now, what's the thinking in Washington? Are we prepared for that? Is there sufficient international strength, and the international institutions are prepared for that wave of difficulties to come, or should more be done? And what should be done? What's your thinking, but what's the thinking in Washington?
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear Danny's voice. Danny and I, we were at an event at Chatham House during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So the time passes, but I think the problems are there. In a nutshell, we are really worried about these debt problems and debt problems turning into financial crisis. Each, crisis starts in a certain way. It has its own twists and turns. When you think about what happened global financial crisis, it took a long time to understand how deep that crisis is. And we thought that the crisis was over in 2010. And then, of course, there was Euro area debt crisis. So in this case as well, we are worried about, especially in the context of emerging market developing economies, some of these economies might having challenges down the road in terms of basically meeting their debt obligations and rolling over debt. Now, what is the the solution, and are we prepared? The simple answer is that I think we have made some headways in terms of at least providing a temporary debt relief to the poorest emerging market developing economies, and the not necessarily coordinated, but the synchronized actions of central banks provided the type of environment that these countries, are still able to issue debt, are still able to take advantage of, international financial markets. Now, will this, period continue? I think we don't know the answer, but there is the possibility sooner or later markets will look around and they say, which ones of these are vulnerable? Which ones of these countries are going to have debt difficulties? And obviously, there is going to be a huge increase in debt. Most of the time, our debt forecasts are under basically estimating the gravity of the debt challenge down the road. So global community is thinking about how to address potential risks. At the same time, we haven't reached a point to have a consensus. I think, unfortunately, most of the time, the problem has to come and hit you on the face to get your act together and respond. And I'm afraid we might end up with the same problem again.
Yeah. I have a real question on my mind, but I won't ask you to answer it. I'll just mention it. It does seem to be that the IMF and the World Bank are sort of morphing into one. The IMF looks more and more like a World Bank, but anyway, I won't get you into trouble there. I would like. There's a couple of questions that really link sort of the epidemic side of the equation with the economy side. One is from Janus Houtegelong, and Professor Günther Dufay is also asking this question. So how do factors, that epidemiological factors, such as the availability of a vaccine, play into the forecast? Or as Professor Dufay asked, is there an upside for emerging markets, especially in Africa, but also because they're so much younger, and would you expect a faster recovery because of that? Can you talk us through a little bit and sort of those interlinkages between the epidemiology and the economic forecast? Thanks. And opening up the lockdown is a third factor. How important is the lockdown for the economy versus the health benefits? Thanks.
Yeah, so let me go through the forecasting process for those who don't know. Now, the problem is that you are facing very large nonlinearities here. So you are trying to think basically kind of what is the daily loss in activity and how it is, accumulated over time. And there you have a very large confidence band around whatever number you pick. The big challenge here, you basically close down the economy and you need to assume at some point you are going to open. Now, in our baseline, we are thinking that that opening basically has already started. So, and that's exactly what happened in many, I think, advanced economies. It is a kind of a very difficult process, as you know, in the case of Asia. And there, at some point, kind of policymakers convince themselves that it is safe to proceed. As soon as that happens and containment measures are not there, kind of you say, okay, activity is going to normalize. The question is, even if you do not have the containment measures, whether people immediately go back to what they used to do. Are they going to go to the restaurants? Are they going to go and have vacations in Bahamas? Obviously, that is not going to happen. So there you need to basically have a the determination, calibration of, how that risk aversion will affect activity. Now, these models on the health side critical when we think about the possibility and the consequences of a second wave. I showed the kind of the daily number of infections in advanced economies. So I think people thought that these states in the United States can open and everything would be fine. And it turned out to be a totally wrong assumption. And some of these states are now postponing their opening process. In some other states, they decided to delay. So these models are very useful in terms of telling us the consequences, because you see an increase in infections, you see an increase in the mortality, and of course, when it happens and it takes off, it really is difficult to contain pretty quickly, unless you implement comprehensive lockdown measures, and that has implications in terms of how you do your forecast. But it boils down to basically when you start, when you lock down, when you end the lockdown, and how you think about the period between the two. And if you are working on the kind of the downside scenario, how that downside scenario materializes. In that context, for example, we are still worried about a serious second wave in winter months and the consequences of that second wave. And there, again, if you don't have the necessary measures in place and people don't follow the kind of the norms that are required to contain the pandemic, you can end up with all types of outcomes. In terms of the possibility of having a vaccine that could have huge implications in terms of normalizing life, but even there is a kind of a lag. You see kind of people having access to vaccine, and then vaccine is being effective, and then basically you see a kind of a broad-based use of the vaccine in multiple countries. So there are significant challenges, Bert, in terms of implementing kind of a broad worldwide vaccine campaign. And there is, of course, a huge uncertainty when that vaccine is going to be available, and when it is available, how effective it's going to be. In terms of African countries, I think there is this issue of they are still on the kind of the positive side of the demographic curve. They have these demographic dividends, relatively young age profile, the challenge is that as much as that's a plus, when you look at the kind of the number of beds available, when you look at the kind of the number of emergency room services available, comprehensiveness of healthcare systems, it is just incomparable with advanced economy services. So, and we saw how some advanced economies struggle in terms of containing the pandemic. And because of that, we are worried. And I think their Latin American experience is critical because Latin America is obviously ahead of Sub-Saharan Africa in many dimensions. Now, for emerging market developing economies, is there a silver lining? I think silver lining is going to boil down to, you know, if these economies accelerate their adoption of digital technologies, accelerate how they use and, you know, basically bring technology into the kind of the educational sphere, into the kind of the business sphere, and the kind of, in a sense, have a kind of leapfrogging. There are upsides, but those upsides only possible, you and I know very well, if there are complementary policies. And it's impossible to implement these policies in isolation without thinking about institutions, without thinking about governance. And we are hopeful that if there is a silver lining, that silver lining is a kind of a general adoption of digital technology in many facets of life. And we see emerging market developing economies seeing that type of you know, change because of their flexible structures much faster than actually advanced economies.
Thanks. Look, we have many more questions, so I'm trying to rush through them and combine them. A question really from Derek Kohn and Yasmin Merikan, and a little bit Yan Wang from Peking University, is what should policymakers be doing that they're not yet doing? And Yan Wang had this very interesting suggestion which came up in the global financial crisis, namely the issuance of SDRs to finance the whole lot, especially for developing countries. But what, in your view, are the type of policy priorities that are not yet happening and that you want to emphasize?
I think if we look at individual economies at the global level, the single most important challenge we have is to make sure we are helping those countries in need. And there, I think there is a lot of scope in terms of providing the necessary help. In those countries, you still see a very significant increase in the number of infections. When there is a crisis, everybody plays for the home team. And unfortunately, but here, really, the global community needs to help those countries in need, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia. The reality on the ground, and Bert, you and I know that we at the World Bank have a good sense of the reality on the ground, is not pleasant. A lot of these countries need immediate help. And something remarkable happened. You know, IMF has now more than 100 country programs. The World Bank has more than 100 country programs. So it's not like, you know, countries are refusing help. They just need help, and that help has to be there. And I think down the road, policymakers need to think about how they can normalize policies, but we are not there yet. I think one good outcome that is during this crisis, there was no hesitant policymaker. Policymakers really put a lot of stimulus into the system pretty quickly provided help in the United States, in Europe, in many emerging market developing economies. So now it's critical to help those they need help. We at the World Bank had very difficult conversations. Government officials, you know, there are some countries, they just rely exclusively on tourism revenues. When you don't have tourists, you are not going to, you know, basically have your economy operating. So this is high time, I think, for coordination of policies, for putting together, I think, the kind of the emphasis on these problems are not the problems of those countries in remote destinations. These are the problems of the global community. So it is important to find a platform to help these economies in a meaningful fashion.
Yeah, thanks. I really wonder, because I mean, we just went through a capital increase. I still say we from time to time if I mean the World Bank. The World Bank just went through a capital increase, but if the rate that this is going, you'll be out of capital very, very soon. Similarly, IMF. They have up to $1 trillion in firepower, Kristalina Georgieva said, but that will not be enough if this continues, even along the lines that you projected. I'm not even talking about the real downside scenarios. But I want to link up to that a little bit with the question of Michael Taylor and Chen Shin of the ADB. And so Michael basically says, look, pretty much looks, this crisis hits at the time when we hadn't really solved all the issues that came out of the global financial crisis. And to what extent does that aggravate the current crisis? And Chen Shin then asked in addition, and are there now increased risks of a financial crisis compared, well, the global financial crisis started with a financial crisis turned into an economic crisis, but will a potential financial crisis resulting from the current situation, will that be as bad as the global financial crisis?
I think when you think about where we were in 2019, we had the lowest growth since the global financial crisis at the global level. We had a serious investment slowdown. We had a serious productivity slowdown. We had a serious growth slowdown, especially in emerging market developed economies. So the global financial crisis left permanent marks on many countries. Trade weakened. Foreign direct investment flows declined dramatically. So when the pandemic hit the global economy was already fragile. And in a sense, you had this slowing growth and increasing debt in basically emerging market developing economies. Now, I don't want to think about another crisis, but of course, we are worried about another crisis, not necessarily a systemic financial crisis, but a financial stress episode triggering a debt, crisis in some emerging market developing economies. If that happens, of course, a natural question to ask whether these countries will have the fiscal space, whether these countries will have the monetary space to respond. And I think the answer is it is highly unlikely they will have that space. And in that sense, we should worry about whether countries, rightly so, they are using the ammunition they have, but what will they do a year from now, 2 years from now, if they face another serious shock? It could be a commodity price collapse. It could be a prolonged period of, weak activity. And I think that Bert, you mentioned the challenges in the context of IMF and the World Bank. I can tell you, as you can imagine, these issues we discuss whether we will have, as an institution, have the firepower to respond 18 months from now. given the kind of the type of demand we have for lending at this point. And that's a serious concern. I think that's a serious concern the global community will consider in the coming months, and I think during the annual meetings as well.
Yeah, thanks. Look, there's lots of interesting creative solutions possible. And one of the encouraging signs that I actually see is in Europe, where finally Europe has decided that a common fiscal policy would be a good idea for this exceptional circumstance. But the analogy is really the international community, linking to Denny Kwa's question and Yang Wang's suggestion. They say, look, for this exceptional circumstance, there could be an additional raising of funds at very low, if not negative, interest rates by the developed world for developing countries, and World Bank and IMF could be very good channels to use in order to bring the money there. We're running almost out of time, and we're definitely not running out of questions, unfortunately. But there was one more technical but highly interesting question, and that is the impact on human capital that you mentioned. And I'm sorry, I can't link a name to it right now, but you said that there's a fairly large impact on human capital formation, which will have over time a lower growth effect. Could you elaborate on that and how these mechanisms are, and what can be done to prevent that?
Oh, thank you. I think this is important, and we have already seen crisis before. When you think about the kind of the human capital, there are two important channels. One, you have a very large number of unemployed, and when people are away from the kind of their jobs for an extended period of time, they might not come back to labor market. When they come back to labor market, they might need new skilling. So whatever the human capital they have, they lose that human capital in their, the previous jobs. Now, there is of course a serious question when basically labor market will be normalized, because the labor market has been subject to kind of the largest shock probably over the past, 80 to 90 years, if not 100 years. Now, the second important issue is how the pandemic affected the kids in primary, secondary, tertiary schooling. I'm not going to talk about colleges, because at least there is a different system and a certain level of maturity. But it is very difficult for these young age kids to learn remotely, and this erosion of ability to learn and get the education necessary at a certain age, and the postponement of that. And this is not going to change during the next 2 or 3 months. We already had the kind of the almost 3 to 4 months of lost schooling. We will add more to that, and that has a kind of a permanent impact on how much human capital we accumulate, and that effect of course gets cascaded when you think about the scope of the crisis and the number of kids around the world affected by the pandemic. And this is not a kind of a emerging developing economy problem. Even in advanced economies, it is a serious challenge at all levels, at all income levels. Parents are having difficulty basically providing schooling at home, and I think that's something definitely kind of a negative associated with this crisis.
Thanks. Yes, I have a hard enough time to just work at home, so I'm glad I don't need to educate any kids. The question came from Aline Wong, by the way, on the human capital. Final question. You've been very patient with us and very, very informative. And that's really around sort of how is this going to end? Chen Gang and Chong and Bai both had a question back to that. Do we ever go back to normal? Or in terms of fiscal monetary policies, is there a normalization within any reasonable horizon? And then Chang'an and a few others emphasize the risk of inflation. Is there any risk of inflation, that we're going to solve quotation mark the debt problem with a bout of inflation? Your views, please.
So in terms of this kind of the easier questions you are asking here, we don't see inflation during the next 2 to 3 years, given the kind of the depressed activity, given the accommodation provided by central banks, and given the experience we had during the past decade. This does not necessarily mean that we won't see inflation spikes in countries, especially those highly indebted economies. And I already mentioned that, you know, some emerging developing economies implementing these QE policies. We don't know how these policies will translate into, you know, kind of the inflation outcomes. If these policies are abused, there are serious consequences, which we know very well from history. Now, in terms of fiscal policy, obviously normalization is going to be extremely difficult. And whatever that normalization will have serious consequences for future generations, because sooner or later, emerging market developing economies need to find a way to stabilize their debt levels. A part of the solution is always to increase revenues. That means higher, of course, taxes. Now, how will the crisis end? I don't think that anybody knows the answer. I think one reasonable guess down the road, if anybody thinks that the crisis is behind us and activity will normalize, will be disappointed. I think that it is difficult to imagine global economy mastering a broad-based recovery unless we contain the pandemic in large advanced economies, in large emerging market developing economies. And of course, we need to stabilize trade. And when you look at the kind of the pace of the pandemic, that is not in sight anytime soon.
Ayhan, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for giving us this wonderful lecture and being incredibly informative on the Q&A. I got a lot out of it. I hope that the many participants got a lot out of it as well. I'm already getting some reactions on my emails, I see. We've had at the peak 242 participants, so a very sizable audience for this highly interesting talk. It's almost 11 in Washington. This is, I know this may just be your normal working days. I know World Bank and IMF are now working around the clock, but nevertheless, thank you so much for joining us. And this was a great lecture. Thanks. And good night.
Thank you, Bert.
And good day, everybody in Asia. Good night, everybody in the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States.